So a lot of my coming back to Kentucky has been also about how we think and dream and imagine community, Renee. I start off talking about how many people in our nation feel very lost and feel that they don't have a place to belong. And I laugh because in my own search for a place of belonging, I have to confess, Kentucky wasn't on my list.
Sure, sure.
So I talk about why Kentucky, why coming home to Kentucky throughout this book of belonging, and the sense of what it means to have a place where you love the landscape. I love the landscape of Kentucky, the hills, the mountains.
The change of seasons.
All of the precious things that we have to protect.
Right.
Certainly I write about mountaintop removal in this book and the things that we need to do. But I think that it's important, you know, to have a place where you feel that you really belong on familiar ground.
Right. And considering that you came from, I guess you could say Hopkinsville is Western Kentucky, how familiar were you growing up, and how has it been a journey for you to understand Appalachia as some of us understand Appalachia to be?
Well, it's interesting that you have our wonderful journal that we publish at Berea College, Appalachian Heritage, and I have a piece in there where I was saying that growing up, interfacing with black people from Eastern Kentucky, that really the idea of Appalachia was not as strong as the notion of black people living the sort of outside the boundaries, because I grew up in the hills of Kentucky as a girl, not in town, so you know, even, and so my sense of my world was much more about nature, the sort of boundlessness of a sense of an expansive frontier. And even in my book, new book, I have a essay on tobacco, because tobacco played such a role in the lives of African American people in many southern states and in Kentucky, that when I think of childhood, what comes to my mind are fields and fields of tobacco and the hills. And so in that sense, a lot of what I think of as my organic childhood experience resonates with all the black people that I've talked to who are like Bill, who are from Eastern Kentucky and who've had similar senses of what it means to grow up in a world where that privileges self-determination and individuals taking care of themselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you talk about the physical landscape of Kentucky has changed so much, not just when you first arrived on the scene, but just in the last 10, 20 years, talking about that we don't have those vast fields of tobacco anymore, and that how mountaintop removal, those things are changing the physical landscape of what Kentucky is about, and how, you know, that's really a part of the culture is just as much as anything else, is that physical landscape.
And I think that's why the issues of sustainability and environmentalism are so crucial. And one of the big myths that I'm trying to challenge in belonging is that black people haven't been interested in the environment. I really talk in this book about black farmers and organic farming among black people, and the fact that these histories, I mean, we were very fortunate a couple of years ago when the Lexington Herald did a whole piece about black farmers and people being run off their land, because this is our history that people are forgetting. I mean, imagine what our world would look like if a lot of black people were coming back to their agrarian roots and growing their own food and being engaged in local food production. And there are many of us here in Kentucky. Certainly Jim Embry has been a big leading light in talking about environmentalism and acknowledging that for us as African American people who were profoundly an agrarian people, we have a tremendous stake in sustainability and environmentalism. And all of those things are things I'm trying to write about in this new book, Belonging: A Culture of Place.
Yes, and speaking of Jim Embry, who we've had on this program, so we put a shameless plug. If you want to see that interview, it's on our website at ket.org/connections, and he does talk about sustainable living and how he's doing these neighborhood gardens, and it's catching on with kids more so than anyone. You know, they get to put their hands in the dirt and play with the worms, but it's really fostering this sense of, you know, getting back to your roots, literally.
And a stewardship of the land. And one wonderful thing I have in this book for me is I talk about the writer Wendell Berry, who was so important to me growing up, and that going to his town of Port Royal and talking with him, and he certainly writes in The Hidden Wound about the two elderly black people who were so important in his childhood as people who knew the woods, as people who worked with herbs, and so that we have that whole sense of a different relationship of black people to the land, not as black people as estranged from the land. And Wendell really, I mean, I call our talk a healing conversation, because I think that here we are with such great distances in our ages. I mean, and yet his work, I said he's been a role model for me and other black folks returning to the South from the North. And I think that that's just really important. Our trajectories are very similar, because he went out to California and New York, the places that I too went, and then felt that urge, that call to home, that it's time to come back.
And that you'll stay here.
Oh, I plan on staying here until I die, which I hope will not be many
soon.
years
That's right.
from now.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. You know, I became very familiar with your work when I was in college, and Sisters of the Yam is one of my favorite books of all time, because
Mine too.
it really is. It is a self-recovery book. It talks about body image and skin color and hair, and how media portrayal and how we try to live up to all those things. How have you seen yourself grow? Because it seems like, are you departing from that feminist theory and philosophy to more of this?
Well, actually, no, because I think any genuine feminism really is about wholeness and self-love for women and men. You know, I certainly believe that patriarchy has no gender, that really, when we talk about feminism, I think of feminism, as my book says, feminism is for everybody.
That's right.
Males and so
too.
For me, I think about my journey to wholeness, of coming back to Kentucky, as very tied into that journey of myself as a feminist, because it was as a young girl here in Kentucky, deciding that I wanted to be an intellectual, a thinker, a writer, that went against so much of the grain of how I was raised, because I was certainly raised in a very serious Christian home, that a woman's place is to be silent, to
didn't talk back.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what you did.
Exactly. So it's a kind of conundrum, because on one hand, I think especially a lot of black girls are raised in the South that this is what a lady should be, but then you're also told that as a black female, if you are going to survive in this world, I mean, my mother knew that her daughters need to get educated. They need to be able to take care of themselves and not feel that they could rely on a man. If you got a man and you could rely on him, fantastic. But the impetus was towards your own self-development and self-actualization. And, you know, I always tell people, Renee, that if you ask me to talk about who I am, the first thing that I'm going to say is that I'm a seeker on a spiritual path, because I feel that it's that spiritual grounding of my being that has sustained me and buoyed me and made me who I am as well. So that I tell people, you know, I don't wake up in the morning and think a black woman is waking up, or a feminist woman, that the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is give praise that we are alive and that we are greeting another wonderful cold day.
Right. But have you always been that way, or did you wake up thinking, oh, another day as a black woman?
No, I think that I was always that way, and then that in part it was very tied to growing up as a child in isolation and in a world where you really are attuned to your senses and the natural environment. I have a home in the hills down in Berea, and you know, when you're out there and it's so quiet, my brothers and sisters and I come there, and we often practice sitting on the porch and closing our eyes and just listening to the sounds. And that's the kind of thing we did as kids.
Right.
Growing up on the hill and just paying attention to the birds and animals and everything. And I think that for me, it's been a circular journey from those things into a more cosmopolitan world where I've had the good fortune, you know, to write these books and to become an intellectual and to be read around the world, but then to come back to that place of your grounding, that foundation.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was just going to say one of the points you do make in Sisters of the Yam is about how are we so modern? Are we so cosmopolitan, which is not the words used in the book, but that you're using now, that we've lost ourselves?
Well, I think a lot of people in our nation feel as though they don't have a sense of identity and they're not sure what their values are. And I think that that's leading lots of people. I mean, that's what Barbara Kingsolver had begun to write about, too, that coming back to where places where people are trying to be at home in the universe. And there's nothing like being at home in a universe where you do have a history and your ancestors. I mean, the first thing I did when I bought my house on the hill was to give praise to the ancestors, the native people and our African American ancestors who worked this land, who, you know, give us a legacy to be truly proud of.
Yeah, and that Appalachia, as Dr. Turner said, you know, when he was growing up in Harlan and Lynch, you know, it was a very diverse population. It was only until he came to Lexington to the flagship university next door to us here that he realized that he was a minority, and that there is such a rich, diverse culture in Appalachia that perhaps many of us just don't know.
One of the joys of being a part of Appalachian Studies at Berea is one of our goals is to make people aware of the vast diversity of Appalachia, that it has multi-dimensions and different experiences, and that there are many more commonalities between black people who are raised in the hills and white people than we have been led to believe.